Julien, who is presenting the PhD thesis entitled Reconstructing Acoustic Heritage, Methods and Tools for Interdisciplinary Research and Audio-Augmented Experiences. So this work was carried out within the Laboratoire d'Acoustique Musicale at Sorbonne Université under the supervision of Brian Katz and in the framework of interdisciplinary collaboration projects. So let me first introduce the members of the team. So the two individuals are Alexandre, Vincent, who is professor in modern history from the Laboratory, Université, Lyon. And Professor Christoph Pörschmann from the Faculty of Information, Media and Electrical Engineering at the University of Applied Science in Köln, officially called PhD. And now the examiners are Professor Tess, Knighton, from the Université Autonoma de Barcelona. And Olivier, who is the research director at IRCAM, in the Science and Technology Science Laboratory. And finally myself, Hélie, Sonores research director in the same laboratory as Olivier. And the supervisor, which is Dr. Brian Katz, research director at ICREA in the Jean-Le-Rond-Amanders laboratory at Sorbonne. So, Julien, you will now have about 45 minutes to present your work, for which we will proceed to questions.
Thank you. So, hello from Paris to all the attendees. I'm very honored to be presenting my doctoral work today, entitled Reconstructing Acoustic Heritage, Methods and Tools for Interdisciplinary Research and Audio-Augmented Experiences. Before starting, I would like to thank my jury for accepting to review my work, as well as all the attendees, either in this room or attending online. My doctoral work was founded by the Past as Ears project, which looked at the acoustics of ancient places across Europe. The Past as Ears at Notre Dame project, the French version of the FE project, specifically looking at the acoustics of the famous Parisian cathedral throughout its long history, and the working group on acoustics from the Chantier Scientifique CNRS, Ministère de la Culture. Let's start with the definition. So what is acoustic heritage? Well, it reveals the sonic identity of past societies and places, and it's investigated by archæoacoustics. Its importance is underscored by the one UNESCO convention. So fundamentally, archæoacoustics is a multidisciplinary research field, my contribution being in the field of room acoustics. It studies the acoustic properties of archaeological sites and places and investigates production and perception of sound in past societies. A few notable archaeoacoustic studies, the Teatro La Fenice, which, thanks to this study carried out before the fire of '96, they could rebuild this famous theater in Venice exactly as it was before. Archaeoacoustic studies, they span a very large geographical area and different civilizations as well. For example, the Chichen Itza project, this is Yucatan, Mexico, that looks at the acoustics of the Kukulkan temple, other in the Mediterranean basin, in the UK, well, all across the world. For example, the Stone Age project, the authors looked at the acoustics of this very famous prehistoric site through the use of scale models. So how cool is that, right? Okay, so my research covers a large variety of disciplines. However, my contribution as an acoustician was to provide historical context through sound based on evidence provided by the humanities. A few research questions that my doctoral work addressed. So first, how can reconstructed acoustic heritage help understand better the scenic environment of past societies using room acoustics modeling and auralisation, for example? How can it be made audible for modern day listeners? And finally, can it enhance public engagement in cultural mediation applications? So as my thesis explored different applications of acoustic heritage reconstruction, my presentation is divided into 3 parts, each aiming at specific target user groups. We'll start with the first part that looks at how acoustics and humanities can contribute. It's not shared? Okay, yeah, I can do that, of course. Yeah, thank you. Is that better, Tess? Is it shared? No?
I can't see anything yet.
Maybe go back one and come back again? No, just back one slide and come back?
Oh, yeah. Can do that. Is that better?
Unfortunately, I just have a black screen.
Okay. Let me try that again. Yep.
It always does.
Maybe I can do. Yeah, that's true. This one. Yeah. Is that better, Tess, or not? Not really.
No, I'm sorry.
Well, maybe it's my side. Maybe I'll refresh and see what happens.
No? What can we do? I can send maybe the slideshow.
I'm trying to refresh yours one more time. Just refresh the...
Sure. Sure.
Yeah, there we go.
Ah, very good.
Yes.
Excellent. Oops, sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, no problem. All right. So this presentation is divided into 3 parts, each looking at a
I
specific.
can't hear it.
Sorry, that's my fault.
Okay. So this present.
Now I can
Yeah?
hear.
Testing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
All right. So my presentation is divided into 3 parts, each looking at a specific target user group. Sorry. So the first part deals with how room acoustics and humanities research can collaborate. This is aimed at the research community. In the second part, we'll be looking at auralisation techniques of acoustic heritage. This part is mostly aimed at musicians and users of VR experiences. This is the technical part of my presentation. And finally, in the last part, we'll be looking at specific application of acoustic heritage for cultural mediation. Okay, so let's now move on to the first part. And as a first example of collaboration with the humanities, I looked at the acoustics of Notre Dame before the fire of 2019. So as you may know, the cathedral underwent a fire in 2019 that left many damages. Because of that, the acoustics from before the fire are gone forever. So I worked jointly with an anthropologist and a sociologist. And we combined an anthropological survey with some practitioners of Notre Dame, and we combined that with geometrical acoustic analysis. The idea was to collect testimonies and to see whether the acoustic analysis could objectively look at the perceptual results. Regarding the anthropological survey, we realized very soon that we had to face several challenges. For example, the difficulty of deciphering some acoustic testimonies, as confirmed by these quotes, as well as the fact that their testimonies relied mostly or entirely on memory, specifically in an emotionally charged context. So the main question was, how can those testimonies be looked at objectively? On the left image, you can see the GA model of Notre Dame that already existed, and that was developed by some of my colleagues from the lab and that I used in my simulations. And on the floor plan of Notre Dame, you can see 3 different positions, typical positions for the singers that I used in my simulations. So in blue, the podium, in red, the space between the stalls, and in yellow, and next to the Pietà sculpture. We looked at different acoustic characteristics that were mentioned in the testimonies. First, the ease of mutual listening in an ensemble, and for that we used the early stage support metric. It's a standardized metric with higher values denoting a higher ease of mutual listening. We compared 2 positions, including the space between the stalls, where the musicians reported that they can hear each other better. This is the typical position for singers during the masses. And STLE in this position was calculated at -12 dBs, which is a typical value even for concert venues, which are buildings specifically designed for music performance as opposed to cathedrals. And we compared this position with the podium, where they reported that the sound gets lost. And indeed, STLE was calculated at -25 dB, so 13 dBs lower, which denotes a lower ease of mutual listening compared to the space between the stalls. So this is just an example that illustrates that acoustic analysis can test objectively the testimonies. We looked at another characteristics, the intelligibility in the nave, so that's mostly now for listeners sitting in the nave, using this time the center time, abbreviated TS, with lower values indicating a higher intelligibility. And we did that based on some testimonies reporting that the sound in the nave can be sometimes quite messy, quote, specifically at the back of the nave. And for that we ran 3 simulations. We compared 3 situations for different positions of the singers. So if we compare scenario A and B, we can see, so I forgot to mention that the bright colors indicate higher intelligibility and darker colors indicate lower intelligibility. So when we compare A and B, so the singers at the Pietà and between the stalls, we can see that the intelligibility in the nave is rather low, with TS value consistently above 400 milliseconds. So there's no clear benefit of having the singers closer to the nave. And then if we look at simulation C, singers at the podium, then the intelligibility increases in the first rows of seats of the cathedral before dropping again past the pulpit, which is situated here, with values of TS again above 400 milliseconds. We can conclude from this comparison that the transept seemed to act as a barrier for intelligibility. So as the sound travels from the choir, suddenly it encounters this widely open space, the transept, so that the sound energy goes to all directions of space, resulting in a poor intelligibility in the nave. It's also important to note that in the cathedral, they are used to use an amplification system, either for the speech or the music or the singing, which probably compensates for this lack of intelligibility in the nave. In the light of these results, we can conclude that several acoustic characteristics were revealed by testimonies and further tested with the acoustic analysis. So the acoustic modeling can serve as a complementary tool to assess acoustic perceptions. These results of this study were published in the Journal of Cultural Heritage, and the research perspectives include testing more testimonies, and the collaborative process could also be repeated regarding the post-restoration acoustics, which is now possible thanks to measurements that we carried out a few weeks ago in the brand new Notre Dame. Okay, the second collaborative study that was more substantial for my doctoral work was intended to see how room acoustics could contribute to another field of the humanities, namely musicology. It tackled the acoustics of the Great Chapel of the Palais des Papes, specifically in the 14th century, which was a place where the Ars Nova repertoire, a polyphonic singing repertoire, was practiced. So as opposed to the previous study, in this study, I developed the GA model of the Great Chapel to reconstruct the context of past music performance. And in addition to the acoustic analysis, it was also used for auralisation, which provides, hopefully, perceptual insight into the reception of Ars Nova. So as for the method, I collaborated with a musicologist, Julien, who is present today in this room. And I specifically developed the GA model of the chapel, so in the modern state and medieval states, based on archives on the medieval chapel decoration and the practice of Ars Nova that were provided by my colleague musicologist. So let's look at how I developed the GA model. So I started with the modern and then derived its medieval counterpart. So it all started with in situ acoustic measurements. I then developed the geometric model based on an already existing 3D model and a laser scan that I used as a reference. I then assigned first assignment of the material properties based on published database, and those properties were further refined until the simulations matched the measurements in a process called acoustic calibration, which is detailed in the publication indicated at the bottom of this slide. So at that stage, we have the calibrated model of the modern chapel, and I derived the medieval counterpart by introducing the changes of architecture and decoration in the model based on my colleagues' research outputs. Okay, so if we look at the reversion time, so this is the reversion time in seconds along the y-axis and the octave bands along the x-axis. So the modern chapel, this is the blue curve, has a reverberation time of 12 seconds in the lowest frequency bands, which is quite huge, long, even longer than in Notre Dame, for example. And the medieval chapel has quite drier acoustics with a 60% decrease at 1 kilohertz. We also included an audience in the model to simulate the presence of a large audience, as it was likely the case during papal masses. So when we include the audience, we can see that the reverberation time is further reduced with a greater impact in the modern chapel compared to the medieval chapel. Another characteristic that we looked at is the intelligibility of the singing as a function of the position in the chapel. Using center time again. So we can observe that the modern chapel has a much decreased intelligibility compared to the medieval chapel. I created some oralizations that give perceptual insights into those differences of intelligibility. So now we'll be listening to an example of the piece Petre Clemens, interpreted by the ensemble Diabolus in Musica, from A4 position, which was the position of the Pope. We'll first listen to the medieval chapel and then move on to the modern chapel. And now modern. So as we all clearly heard, the intelligibility in the medieval chapel was much higher than in the modern chapel. So a few conclusions. The GA modeling helped recreate the acoustic context of this ancient performance space, which offers new perspectives for research in medieval musicology. And auralisation also reveals some perceptual differences between historical states and also across listener positions, even though we didn't test those before. But I have published more auralizations on a SoundCloud page. Those results were published in different conference publications, and as research perspective for the musicology side of things, a more formal perceptual experiment on singing intelligibility could be conducted to complement the analysis. And regarding the room acoustics, the GA model of the medieval chapel could be refined using supplementary archives, specifically on the interior decoration of the medieval chapel, as well as based on actual measurement of the acoustic properties of those ancient materials. Okay, so now let's move to the second part of this presentation, which now is aimed at a broader group of users. And we'll start with the musicians. So in this study, in the next study, I designed an interactive auralization system for singer from ensemble, sorry. And for that, the objective was to design a real-time auralization system using virtual acoustics for headphones reproduction and individual microphone. The system should ensure acceptable singing comfort while still enabling for dry individual recordings. As for the method, we conducted a series of prototyping sessions here in this lab at Sorbonne University before conducting a live experiment with the ensemble Diabolus in Musique. Okay, so let's look now more in detail into the auralization system, and for now we'll be focusing on the auralization of the voice of singer one. So as singer one sings, the direct sound of his voice, naturally traveling through the air, passes through the open back headphones of singer two. And the reverberated part of his voice is achieved through a real-time convolution with a binaural room impulse response that was generated with the GA model of the Palais des Papes. So this one is labeled binaural room impulse response source 1 receiver 2 without direct sound. So that the direct sound and reverberated sound, they would sum up when they reach the ear canal of the second singer. This process has to be repeated for singer 3 and 4 and for singer 1 himself. So this is valid only for the voice of singer 1, but of course it has to be repeated for the voice of each of the other singers. So we end up with this block diagram that includes 16 convolutions. Because of course, each singer plays the role of both a source and a receiver, but also on this diagram, the conductor is not shown. The conductor playing the role only of a receiver, we have to add 4 extra convolutions to the whole system. So the MAPI project aimed to study the impact of acoustics on the singing performance. So I created various auralizations, including the following conditions. So the room, either the modern or the medieval chapel. The position on axis, so here the singers are depicted by red squares. This is the on-axis position, the other one is off-axis position. And regarding the arrangement, so either arc, this is this arrangement, or staggered. And the repertoire included pieces of Gregorian chant and Ars Nova repertoire. We collected the feedback of the musicians after the experiment. So for example, some mentioned that the medieval room seemed to be better suited for polyphonic performance, whereas the modern room seemed to be more forgiving regarding small flows and inaccuracies. The off-axis position was preferred, at least by some of them, because of a higher ease of ensemble singing, which is probably due to the closer proximity of the stalls, creating a prominent reflection, which is beneficial to the ease of ensemble singing. And we had the same remark regarding the staggered arrangement, this time probably due to a reduced inter-singer distance compared to the other arrangement. Positive feedback in general. So the musicians, they praised the novelty of the experience, also the variety of environments that the system was able to produce, so that they considered it as a valid tool for historically informed performance. And on the negative side of things, they complained about the discomfort of headphones reproduction, probably due to a lack of acoustic transparency of the headphones we used. We can then conclude that the system seemed to be able to simulate diverse acoustic scenarios for ensemble singing, and it also allowed to obtain dry individual recordings that were used in post-auralizations, that we heard some example of those in the previous study. As a possible improvement, so we should be using more transparent headphones probably, which was actually used in a further experiment conducted by my colleague Sarah Beth, who is present in this room today. The results were published in the Journal of Sound Studies. Okay, another study that deals with auralization, but this time looking more at users of VR experience, deals with dynamic auralization for navigable environments, so where the user can move throughout the auditory scene. Those environments can be used to create, for example, a virtual museum visit, including some sources that are attached to artifacts of the museum, or maybe, for example, to an avatar of a virtual guide. So in a navigation context, the auditory, the reproduction, of the auditory scene must continuously adapt to the listener position. And the approach we followed for that uses a grid of room impulse responses distributed in the navigation area. So when the listener coincides with one node of the grid, the reproduction is ideal. But then what shall we do when it's lying in between the nodes? So several methods exist. The first one being to look for the closest one and select it, use the room impulse response as is, a process which is called the single nearest neighbor selection, abbreviated 1NN, and that was used in a previous study by Neidhart and Reif, where the authors investigated how smoothly the auditory scene changes during listener navigation, depending on the density of a grid of binaural room impulse responses. Alternatively, we can also look for the three closest ones and combine them together with the specific weights in a triangulation fashion, a process called three nearest neighbors interpolation, abbreviated 3NN. So here in this example, L being closer to 1 than to the two other nodes, the contribution of node 1 must be higher than the contribution of the other nodes in the interpolation. So it must be reflected by the different weights applied to each node in the interpolation. So either 1NN or 3NN can only approximate the ideal reproduction that a room impulse response would produce if it was available at the actual listener position. And this approximation can generate interpolation artifacts. So the present study looked at how interpolation artifact could impact the naturalness or plausibility of the auditory scene during listener navigation. And the goal was also to compare our results with those of the previous results, but this time using ambisonic room impulse responses, and also by including 3NN methods in the comparison. So we combined a perceptual experiment and an objective model, and we studied the perceived stability of a non-visible nearby source. Regarding the conditions, first we tested several grid sizes. So here you have the navigation zone. This is a 2 by 2 meter square with a source fixed in space, non-visible at 1.5 meter in front. And the blue markers are the nodes of the 2 meter grid. Sorry for that. So this is the 2 meter grid. Here you have the 1 meter grid and the 50 centimeters grid. Then we compare different panning laws, including 1NN selection, as used in the previous study, as well as two different 3NN panning laws, 3NN dist and 3NN area. So compared to 3NN dist, 3NN area was expected to offer smoother transitions between triangles. And we also included two room acoustic conditions. So regarding the perceptual experiment, the visual environment was developed in Unity. So this is basically a large room and the navigation area in the center of this room, bounded within museum ropes. It was rendered over Oculus Quest 2, as you can see on this picture, and the auditory environment was processed in MaxMSP and rendered over headphones. We used as a stimulus the sound of a crank, which is a periodic sequence of percussive sounds. Sorry for that. And we chose this sound because it is known to maximize the localizability of sound. And at the end of each trial, participants were asked, in this scenario, how would you judge the instability of the source position when you navigate? And they had to answer using a 7-point Likert scale with higher ratings, denoting a higher perceived source stability. So now let's look at the results. Here, y-axis indicates the rating. So higher values mean higher perceived source stability, and the x-axis is the increasing grid size, and the different colors depict the different panning laws that we compared. So what can we observe? Already, the larger the grid size, the lower the perceived stability in general. 3NN methods seem to outperform 1NN methods regardless of the grid size. For 3NN methods, it seems that there's no clear benefit of going for a grid smaller than 1 meter. The two 3NN methods tested seem to provide the same results, except maybe for the 2-meter grid size, where 3NN areas seem to outperform 3NN distance. And finally, the combination 1NN 50 centimeters seem to perform similarly or even better than the combination 3NN and 2 meters grid size. We compared our results with those of the previous studies, so which are indicated by the gray boxes. And it seems that they align pretty well, at least for the 2 grid size that we commonly tested. So here we have to compare the gray boxes with the blue boxes, which is the 1NN methods for our study. And regarding the objective model, so the objective model computed the error of direction of arrival, abbreviated DOA, using an estimation of the interoral time difference. So what is the DOA error? So depending on your position in the navigation area, since the source is fixed in space, there is a theoretical incoming direction. But because of interpolation artifacts, the perceived direction might be slightly different, resulting in a DOA error. So here we have an example of the map of DOA error for a specific combination of grid size and panning law with the source fixed in front. Here the brighter colors denote 0 DOA error, and darker colors denote a higher DOA error. So for example, we can see that when we walk along the symmetry axis, along this line, the error is consistently 0, meaning that the perceived incoming direction matches perfectly the theoretical incoming direction. So here, the source being in front, we clearly perceive the source as coming from the front. When we move to a side, so for example here, whereas the theoretical incoming direction shall be this one, because of interpolation artifacts, the one that I perceive is slightly different, resulting in a non-zero DOA error. Those maps were computed for all combinations of grid sizes and panning laws. So what can we observe? Across panning laws, 1NN method seem to provide the highest errors, highest DOA errors. Across the grid sizes, this is the 2-meter grid size that seem to provide the highest DOA errors. Also, we can observe some similarities. For example, here, the 2 3NN methods with the 2 smaller grid sizes, which is a result that we already observed on the perceptual results. So it can be concluded that the objective and subjective results align pretty well. And also, those results can offer some guidelines for designing navigable VR environments. So for example, we can maximize or optimize the source stability, the perceived source stability, using 3NN over 1NN method. But of course, this requires the reproduction device to have enough processing power, because 3NN methods are obviously more complex than 1NN method. Also, for 3NN method, there's no need to go for a grid finer than 1 meter, which can offer some insight into how to optimize the storage space on the reproduction device, because of course, 50 centimeter grid size has more nodes, so it requires more space. And finally, the comparison between 1NN 50 centimeters and 3NN 2 meters also offers some insights into how to optimize the processing power, but only if the storage space allows. Those results were published in the Journal of the Audio Engineering Society. The research perspectives include testing other perceptual attributes, for example, the apparent source width or the spectral coloration. And we could also evaluate the impacts of different ambisonic orders or the use of individualized HRTFs. We use non-individualized HRTFs in this study. And finally, we want to also add a visual reference for the source to see whether having a visual reference could impact the results on perceived source stability during navigation. Okay, this takes us to the last part of my presentation. So here, this study targets a new user group, namely visitors at cultural heritage sites, with the project Notre Dame Whispers. So Notre Dame Whispers is an audio-guided tour on Notre Dame sonic history using a mobile application, and it uses reconstructed acoustics and historically informed soundscapes. So the objective of this study was to see how we could turn complex topics issued from the academic research into an engaging visiting experience. We also conducted an on-site survey to evaluate those aspects. So in general, the question that we tried to solve was, can reconstructed acoustic heritage be applied in next generation audio guides? So my contributions were various, as this project was very important to me because I saw it as a concrete application of how to use the outputs of my research and use it for public applications. This project was led in the scope of the FEN project in collaboration with the mediation, cultural mediation agency Tokartiv, with all the partners from the FEN project, but also with some extra partners, including the Collegium Musique, the Opus, d'Impamir, et la Cathédrale Notre-Dame de Paris. So Notre Dame Whispers uses, as I said, district soundscapes, as well as an embodied narrative. So we have a narrator that embodies the cathedral itself. It covers multiple time eras of the sonic history of the cathedral. It's embedded into Echo of Notre Dame de Paris, which is a free geolocated mobile application with static binaural reproduction. It's available for iOS and Android in French, English, and Spanish. And the tour has 6 waypoints distributed around the cathedral with a total of 12 audio pieces. Regarding the audio content design, which was one of my contributions in this project, so we recorded several FEN partners participated into the recordings of historically informed sound elements, including myself. So for example, from left to right, the facsimile of a medieval organ, then the singers of Rue des Chantres, using the Auralisation system that we described before. That was a recording session here in the anechoic room of Sorbonne University. Recording of the bells from the Sens Cathedral, as well as on the right, recordings of a stone cutter that was done by my colleague from the FEN project from MSH Lyon, who is also present in this room today. Regarding auralizations, I use different models of the cathedral corresponding to different time eras. So here I put a few examples. So to the left, and also you can see the associated audio piece of the audio guide where they are used. So to the left, we compare the acoustics of the pre-Gothic basilica that lied on the Parvis before Notre Dame was constructed with the cathedral Notre Dame from before the fire. And as you can see here, the blue circle denoting the position of the receiver and the red one denoting the position of the source, we simulated the same acoustic scenario in both buildings so that the visitor can experience the difference of acoustics across the two buildings. In the middle, we have the GA model of Notre Dame from the late 12th century, when only the choir was built and closed by a temporary wall. And then another example of the cathedral in the early 15th century, when the rest of the building was already constructed. So I don't know if time allows. How much time is there, Thomas? 10 minutes. Yeah, that should be fine. Okay, so as I participated in the audio design and the creation of the audio content, I wanted maybe to show some quick examples. So this piece is called The School of Notre Dame. The visitor is taken inside the liturgical choir of the cathedral in the 12th century to attend a performance of the Vinderunt Omnes, a famous music piece from the polyphonic chant repertoire. And it's interpreted by the cantors. So it is literally lying in between the cantors. So I just took a short extract of it and broke it down into 3 phases. First, we have a context phase where the narrator gives a description of the space, but it's also suggested by the soundscapes, in particular the cardinals that are stepping over the stalls and sitting down in the stalls. Those soundscapes were recorded at the Sens Cathedral with the binaural dummy head. So let's go.
Here we are in my choir, richly decorated for the celebration.
Okay.
Around us, there are the stalls, a wooden construction in a U-shape with rows of seats. Listen, the Notre Dame chapter take their places. And around us, 4 cannons are preparing to sing.
Okay, the second phase is the experience phase, where the listener will get familiar with the performance of the Vinderunt Omnes. Let's go.
Starting. Vinderunt Omnes, a well-known chant from the Christmas liturgy.
So the voices of the singers were oralized using simulations run with this model of Notre Dame. And then the last phase, which I call didactic, because then the listener will have a chance to understand a bit better, hopefully, how polyphonic chant works. Let's see.
On your left, you can hear a man holding a long, low note. He's called the tenor. In fact, he provides support on which the other singers, those on your right, take their cues and join in an ensemble improvisation.
So here, each singer was put in different positions using spatialization tools, but also they started to sing one after the other, which never occurred actually during the recordings, but that was done in post-processing using the individual recordings of the singers. Okay, so we also conducted a public survey of this audio guide during a whole week on the Parvis with a team of mediators. The evaluation process was designed in collaboration with an engineer from Summit, and it used user analytics that were anonymously collected through the application, but also questionnaires and interviews for the volunteers. And the closed questions were formulated in the form of assertion, asking for the level of agreement. We had a total of 235 respondents covering a large age span. And apparently there was a pretty high enthusiasm for the visit with a high level of general visit satisfaction. And regarding the learning potential, 78% of the respondents declared that they had learned something that they didn't know before the visit. So those ratings are pretty high, but of course there might be a bias as the questionnaires was answered only by volunteers. So likely the people more positive about the visit. A few figures more. And specifically, so we ask for different aspects of the visit and the application, but those are mostly regarding the audio content and the experience, because this was part of my contribution. So a high number praised the realism of the soundscapes. Same for the immersive character of the experience. The narrator was just as quite captivating, and the topics as quite interesting as well. We can conclude from these numbers that reconstructed acoustic heritage can enrich the content of audio-guided visits because somehow it creates the conditions of a sensory experience. And also it was confirmed by the evaluation showing a strong satisfaction, visitor engagement, and learning potential. So the results of this study were published in various conference and a journal paper. And the research perspective include maybe a more formal study to assess the learning potential, for example, through pre and post questionnaires, maybe with school groups. Also, it depends on, of course, an accurate reconstruction and technical aspects. For example, the mode of reproduction of the audio content. We could, for example, compare stereo content with static binaural and head-tracked binaural and its impact on the immersive character of the visit. And on a personal level, I am willing to participate in other similar projects, some of which are already running. So for example, through my involvement in the Acoustic Heritage Task Force of the European Tech Consortium. Okay, that brings me to the conclusion of this presentation. So in this presentation, I demonstrated how I investigated acoustic heritage reconstructions through the lens of multidisciplinary research with the humanities. I also developed tools for the auralisation of historical space, both for active musicians and passive listeners, the VR users. And I demonstrated use cases of spatial audio and virtual acoustics through cultural mediation applications. So as final conclusions, organized along my research questions. So reconstructed acoustics provide a means to contextualize historical spaces, supporting interpretation of sound perception and practices in past culture. Auralisation techniques, both for musicians and passive listeners, enable immersive experiences for contemporary audiences, bridging past and present. And when applied in mobile apps and audio-augmented reality settings, reconstructed acoustics enrich visitor experiences and foster engagement with intangible cultural heritage. This concludes my presentation, so I thank you for your attention. Really?